Hi, I'm James Brookes, and welcome to From the Factory Floor, a conversational podcast about all things startup and tech, brought to you by the folks at tsf.tech. So, welcome everyone to From the Factory Floor. So, this week, as ever, Ian, you had a bit of a week off last week, and while I spoke with Alexa and Eric.
I did. I had a sabbatical, didn't I? Sound of my own voice.
I know, it's a rare one when I was like, my usual co-host Ian, and I was like, actually, he's not here. So, and obviously we're joined once again by Elliot. Welcome back.
Hi, James. Hi, Ian.
Hi, Elliot.
So, obviously today we kind of teased it at the end of the last podcast. Obviously before we spoke about revenue, budgets and that sort of thing, I really want to go into the cash flow and managing that from a startup perspective. So obviously, Elliot, I think your expertise here are invaluable, and obviously the experience Ian and I've got as well. So opening up as a starter for 10, what is a cash flow?
Simplest terms, it's an analysis of the cash inflows and outflows of a business, and following on from that, of the net change in cash. It's, some people think it's a profit and loss. It's actually slightly different to a profit and loss, because obviously you can raise an invoice to a customer, but you don't necessarily get paid straight away if there's credit terms. So just because you're a profitable business doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a positive cash flow. And it's an extremely important document to have at any stage of a business, because if you run out of cash or don't see that you're going to run out of cash, obviously if you can't borrow, it can be the difference between the success and failure of the business. So it's an extremely important document. Many people tend to build it up in the software of choice for accountants, which generally tends to be Excel. But these days there is specific cash flow software which does tend to use more accurate data for it, because it can obviously go through the historic data and see what trends are there, such as when customers actually pay, which is quite often sometimes outside of credit terms. So it can use accurate debtor days and creditor days as an example. But certainly in the earliest stages, for a startup business, I'd generally suggest that you build up something basic in Excel.
Good point, Elliot. Good point to start, I think, because I think on a previous podcast we talked about your first revenue budget, and most startups have that mantra of we need to go out and sell. But of course, you can when you make your first sale, you don't collect your cash potentially for 30 days. And that kind of tends to be forgotten in the euphoria and the excitement. We've got some new customers, we're making some sales. And that kind of, again, I think what you bring to this series of podcasts is that voice of reason and reality that, without the cash, you can't you pay your wages, you can't do anything you want to do.
Correct. Well, if we look at it at the very earliest stages, quite often the funder of the business is the founder, so to speak. They might have done a bit of a friends and family fundraise. Clearly, they've got an amount of money in the pot. They need to establish, what they've got available, what their expenses are going to be, and how that actually models out over a period of time. But, just as important for the business, obviously the founders on a personal level as well is something that I don't think, gets looked at quite often. You start a business up, if you haven't got some cash behind you, personally as well, clearly you've got a mortgage and other outgoings to speak. So quite often the founder needs a personal cash flow as well as a business cash flow, because they can kind of go hand in hand at them kind of earlier stages when, founders are probably not taking a salary out of the business at that point of time, if it's pre-revenue, as an example. So I'd probably recommend, at its early stages, you kind of need two kind of running side by side, because if an individual's, got pressures personally, quite often that can affect on the business as well from a cash perspective.
Yeah, we kind of use it's a bit of a throwaway phrase, but what do you need to pay the Tesco bill? Because while you are putting your money into the growth of the business, you've got to survive and feed. And James knows, we've had 2 or 3 instances where we've had some interesting people come into the startup factory with some really quite cracking ideas, but their personal financial circumstances, they're in a job, they've got 2 kids, they've got a mortgage, and wrangling that personal financial exposure and making sure you've got the headspace and the time is a key consideration. So I think that's a cracking piece of advice. Personal cash flow alongside your startup cash flow, definitely.
Yeah, completely.
And I think the other point you raised as well is obviously look at, especially when you start to building it, and I guess we can go a little bit more into that, looking at the agreements you have on payment terms. I mean, you mentioned, I think it was, you might be 30 days, might be 15 days. I mean, in a previous life, I saw someone who was so excited about a deal that they got in construction. It was 120-day payment terms. So obviously, if you then got a building, you're not actually going to, you've got to buy the stuff in to then sell it, but you're not actually going to get the money for 3 months.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. And as I always say with these documents, the outputs of these documents are only as good as the inputs. So the starting point to anything really is you do need your accounts, good quality and up to date, so that your starting position, what your receivables are, what your payables are. Obviously, if you've got a break-even drafted, you've got a fair idea of what your monthly expenditures going to be, and I think that's got to be your basic starting point in terms of building this up. Something you touched on there, James. Obviously, with your relationships with your customers and your receivables, it's important that you set and agree reasonable credit terms on day one. You've got good credit control procedures in place, so that you're not, when something becomes due, you don't decide to start chasing that debt then for another 30, 60, 90 days, as an example then, which is going to have a huge impact on cash flow at a later date.
Yeah, and that steps back into the earlier podcast, which again I recommend any first-time founders are thinking of, to the legal session we did with John Davidge from Berman's, because your terms and conditions are really important. It's all very well getting your MVP nice, polished and shiny, thinking about your pricing strategy, but you've got to have those terms and conditions. So there's always the boring bits of a startup, which people kind of forget, but they are actually so vital to kind of the workings and the kind of the living and breathing of once you get going. So make sure you get the terms and conditions. And then, do you know what, Elliot? You've got to chase the money. I think it doesn't, some people will kind of respect you, but you've then got to get on the phone and you've got to make sure the payment comes in, so you collect what you're due.
Correct. And that can be hard because, that can lead to confrontations, as we'll have all experienced ourselves in businesses over the years, because quite often, cash flow, it goes through the business chain and everybody wants to manage the cash flow and have a positive cash flow themselves. So as you kind of get further down the chain, if you've not been paid on time, quite often that means that your customer
not paying someone else.
Not been paid on time themselves. So that, kind of works its way throughout the chain. But I do think there is it's a cultural thing in the UK is, people don't seem that bothered about not paying people on time to a certain degree compared to, in other countries, as an example, they do see that as a massive thing. If you've not paid your bills on time, that's seen as a big failure on a business's behalf. But I think in the UK, it's to a certain degree, it's become acceptable to manage your customers, manage your suppliers to a certain degree, because it's all part of, the greater good for your business.
Yeah. And I think there's two aspects as well. There's kind of the ins and the outs. And I think people tend to overestimate the potential for the ins in terms of revenue and what we can sell and cash can come in, and tend to underestimate the kind of the cost as well. So back to a bit of advice you gave us, Elliot, on that first financial session about having different kind of scenarios in your planning and your financial modelling.
Yeah, I think, certainly in a short-term cash flow, you can be pretty accurate in terms of knowing what's going to come in and when, if you work as you kind of trade debtors, age receivables as the starting point. Clearly, the longer period that you expand to, you have to start putting some assumptions and some estimates into the model.
So what are we classing as short term when it comes to a cash flow? Because obviously we've seen it, in our own practices. You're looking at 3, 6 to 12 month cash flows, and obviously you almost look at the cone of uncertainty and go, pretty sure we know what's happening in the next 3 months. And then the 3 months after that, we probably know, we have a good idea, and the further out you get. So when we're talking about a short term cash flow, what sort of scale are we thinking?
I generally talk about short term as being anything between 3 to 6 months, maybe up to a year. and it's very maximum. Clearly, as you get beyond that, if you're looking at 1 to 3 years, that's clearly something that's going to be more linked to the kind of business vision, strategy of the business, along with its kind of accompanying projections and balance sheet that you'd probably have along with the cash flow. Whereas you probably wouldn't have that with the short-term cash flow, which tends to be used more to manage the kind of day-to-day operational aspects of the business, rather than used as a document as part of the long-term kind of planning of the business.
Yeah, it's also, I think, perhaps your bank may want to see the cash flows as well. So you're preparing it for internal purposes, but you've either got a loan or you've got a facility, or you're working towards getting a facility as a startup. So those cash flow forecasts also are important for external purposes. And I like the concept of having a rolling forecast as well, Elliot, which you update on a monthly basis. And you don't get overly concerned on a weekly basis, but you've got to have your finger on the pulse here. So I kind of like that horizon. I think that's a sensible period to look at.
Yeah. I'm a big believer on the kind of monthly basis of doing things. I know some people do like a 13-week kind of rolling cash flow, and that tends to be used quite often where people are micromanaging the cash flow. But I tend to get, certainly people I work with, to get into like a certain key ways of managing things, such as a monthly supplier run. So rather than actually paying people ad hoc on a weekly basis, and that tends to be managing it on a monthly basis, and you're looking at a slightly bigger picture.
Yeah.
Rather than micromanagement.
Yeah, I think it's always good because obviously we run ours on a monthly basis, and you can kind of see the changes on a fairly regular basis then as to what's coming up, what's projected to come up, and how you sort of, again, going back to the point we raised around how you have the different scenarios in there of looking, actually, this is one potential if everything that we hope comes in. And then actually, if we don't get all that, it looks like this. And obviously that then gives you a far greater insight into the cash flow of the business. And I guess one of the points you're raising is obviously how you use the cash flow. We've spoken to Gavin around due diligence and how you look at the very long-term cash flow, when we've had it where it's sort of a 3-year, that's far more revenue-based than anything else, is on sort of that monthly basis or that 3 to 6 month. What's the general use of the cash flow within a startup?
I think it's to see the pressure points really in effect. The pressure points in terms of where there's going to be surpluses or where there's going to be shortfalls, and what the pressure points are to that. So, for example, if you've got a large debtor due in at a particular point in time, what happens if they don't pay at the end of that particular month for whatever reason, and they pay in the next month? What's the effect that's going to have on cash flow if you shift that payment one column along in the cash flow? What effect is that going to have? Are you going to have enough working capital to pay all your suppliers in the terms that they fall due at that point in time, or are you not? And then obviously that will allow you to see, well, technically we shouldn't or can't pay our suppliers until we've received that payment in, because otherwise we can't pay our salaries on time, as an example. It would give us that foresight on that. And also that's something to a degree that can lead to better supplier management, and better relationships with them, because clearly if you know that there's an issue in advance, clearly you can give your suppliers and the banks, if you need to raise funding, i.e. in the form of a short-term overdraft as an example, you know what's coming up. So you're not ringing somebody on the day, or in fact, and sometimes not ringing at all, to say we can't pay, and then you can negotiate and let people know when you actually are possibly going to be in a position to pay. Or if you need a short-term facility with the bank, clearly you're getting that dealt with and in place in advance rather than after the event.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced this. I think the parallels to kind of managing your personal finances are quite strong, really. I think it's about identifying your spending priorities. Where are those things that you need to commit to and you want to spend? I think it's a bit of Mr. Micawber, being frugal, but frugality doesn't go amiss. I think many startups get a little bit gung-ho. I think kind of being frugal and a principle of having a rainy day reserve.
Yes.
So almost having like, well, actually, we got a 20% balance in the kitty and keeping that, because there will be ebbs and flows, as you suggested, Elliot. And again, one of the things, when you start making sales is things like VAT. If you're making a sale and your invoice is for 10,000, the VAT is 2,000 on top of that.
Yeah.
Now you've got to be paying back that 2,000 in either a monthly or a quarterly basis. So I think getting help's also important as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and that's something that gets missed quite often in a cash flow, predominantly because of the basis. If we're talking about VAT as an example, it's only paid quarterly. So quite often, the sales will get put into the model gross, and the VAT will get completely forgot about. And then obviously, if you're doing a reasonable level of sales, that can be quite a chunky bill that comes in a quarter that sometimes doesn't get budgeted for in the model. So yeah, you have kind of got to be, sometimes you've got to estimate, but you can be pretty reliable in terms of knowing what your VAT will be if you use the data in the model to strip the VAT out of your sales and make an assumption of where you're incurring input VAT. You can be pretty accurate with it. Same with corporation tax. That's another one. Gets paid once a year, and that can get forgot about, especially if quite often people tend to be quite reactive in terms of the compliance. So because you get 9 months to get your accounts done, well, we'll get them done in month 8, and you don't know what your corporation tax liability is then until very, very close to the due date. So how do you factor that into your model? If you're not doing internal management accounts, you've probably got no idea.
Yeah. So it comes back to making sure you've got the right support, because as a founder, you're leading the business, you're either leading the product development, you're looking at building your team, you're looking at getting out there with your first customers. I think there's that much going on. This is one of those things that gets forgotten. And so I think getting the right support, so getting a finance person like yourself, Elliot, as part of that team, as part of that extended team, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think, as a bit of takeaway advice really to anybody that's listening to this really is it's not necessarily something that you have to put together yourself. Clearly, you're going to have some input into it, but you can outsource this to your accountant. Most firms do tend to offer this kind of service level these days, and it can be quite simple to put a high level rolling document together. It's not necessarily a hugely onerous task that's going to be really, really expensive in terms of professional fees. You'll certainly get more value out of it than it will actually cost you.
And it's things like say the corporation tax or VAT, where I can imagine there's quite a lot of pitfalls that, especially if a sort of first time founder, potentially either is aware of but doesn't particularly understand, or isn't actually aware of it in the first place. So that when they're putting their cash flow together, they look at the sales, they look at the outgoings, and actually just building that first version of the cash flow. And there's these really glaring omissions where suddenly they get stung by a bill they weren't expecting. Is there any other kind of really big pitfalls that either of you seen when people have built the first cash flow and you've had to say, have you thought about this? And they've gone, no. And kind of worried, then suddenly had to completely rebuild the model and shift things around.
I think quite often when you're building these things up, there's lots of variables that don't necessarily get thought about. And as Ian kind of touched on earlier, it's probably overstating your income and understating your kind of expenditure. The VAT and the tax one was kind of one that I touched on earlier. One was kind of, identifying them points when you are going to need funding. I think a lot of founders think they can operate a business on a shoestring and get it from, 0 to hero in a certain period of time with not bringing on any other people behind them, other investors, financial institutions, etc. But, most businesses, to expand and at the right time, you're going to need funding. There's going to be a whole host of expenditure that you're going to incur that you're probably not even going to think about on day one. So just to touch on what we talked about there, bringing people alongside you with experience that have probably gone through that process themselves will help you build up, certainly a longer term, we're probably talking more longer term here than short term, will help you build up, a more longer term kind of cash flow model.
I suppose, especially if you're expanding your team, Ian, it's something we've seen quite a lot, and we all know recruitment's hard. If you're just expecting, you put in the cash flow that your expenditure on wages, everything like PAYE, etc., that goes alongside that. But often you have to use recruits, and suddenly there's a 20% bill that comes with every single hire. Obviously, that's something that has to be built in and thought about, which isn't something where you've gone, well, I've accounted for having a bigger team.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's that much to stay on top of as a founder when you're on this crazy startup journey, that you get those shocks, but they can be really, really painful shocks. Cash is the lifeblood, as Elliot referred to earlier in the podcast. You've got to be able to make sure you pay the wages, and people get confused between kind of operational cash needed to run the business, and then growth cash and growth capital in terms of, right, we need to grow the business. Now, bootstrapping, I think, is something we all admire, and I'm a great advocate of to a point where you can generate organic cash flow and your own cash injection, but you can't grow a business while seeking to expand the customer base and hire. The timing of the cash flow just doesn't lend yourself to it, and you're kidding yourself if you think you can do it. So I think to Elliot's point again, it's kind of making sure you understand the ins and the outs, but you understand what it is you're trying to build and the timing around that.
Yeah, and you need headroom as well. It's not all about managing the cash flow down to that last pound in the bank. Clearly, there needs to be headroom in there for unexpected costs, for growth capital. If you need to recruit ahead of the curve, as an example, you do need plenty of headroom in there.
Yeah.
And I guess so as we've talked about the pitfalls, and one of the things you mentioned then, Elliot, was, and I think we said throughout, is that people tend to overstate their income and then understate the costs. Why do you think it is that people are, in general, quite optimistic about one side, when really, if you were sort of looking at this, you'd almost recommend it being the flip of, do you know what, if you run off the worst case scenario, your costs have suddenly got an extra, I don't know, X on top whilst you're losing this revenue. Wouldn't that potentially be a far more sustainable? Because realistically, if you go for the most negative, you'll be above that rather than assuming the positive and it being a bit closer.
Yeah,
expect.
I think we kind of touched on this in the previous podcast, really, on the revenue forecast. But it was kind of that kind of best case, worst case scenario, and the likelihood is that you're going to be somewhere in the middle. I think human nature is we probably do tend to be quite optimistic.
Depends talking about football.
To a certain degree. But I think with this, if they're a business that's a little bit further along, you've obviously got historic data that you can use as kind of the basis to start building the model up, and you've got a good starting point. Clearly, if you've got a sales pipeline, you can use that and make some prudent estimates, based again on historic data. If we've got 10 proposals out there at the moment, and we know normally from 10 that are out there, we normally win 3, as an example, where you can probably assume that you're going to win 30% of the ones that you've currently got out there at the moment, rather than the fact that you're going to win all 10, which some people might very well do and drop all 10 in. But yeah, I think there's certain data points you can use to get a level of accuracy to it, certainly on a kind of short-term basis. On a longer-term basis, clearly you are going to have to put some, estimates in there that are probably not going to have quite the data sets behind it at that point in time.
Yeah, but learning about your sales cycle as well, which is what you're talking about there, Elliot, I think is important. Lead generation, back to that other conversation we had about your revenue budget, start to understand that conversion cycle, I think is really important. And to your point, James, I think all founders are optimistic. They just believe they can change the world. They've got something which everybody wants, which you need that energy, you need that enthusiasm, but you need that little voice on your shoulder or note to self around some of the mechanics of running a startup, which is what this series of podcasts is about. It's not just about the Dragon's Den kind of scenario. It's actually day-to-day running a business. There are 101 things to think about, and I'd say cash is in your top 5. It really is. It has to be something that you're on top of, not necessarily day in, day out, but weekly, to understand where that's going.
Yeah. Well, as we kind of touched on earlier, the use of it for kind of investors, and I think to a certain degree, investors use it as the ultimate measure kind of how your business is doing. They probably put more importance on that than they do on the profit and loss account and balance sheet. Certainly when they're looking at the original kind of deck of documents and they're doing due diligence, they want to know what you need the money for, what you're going to spend it on, and what the key drivers are kind of behind that. So they put huge importance on it, and I totally agree with Ian that it should be in the top set of things that you think about in business.
I think there's that horrible word runway, Elliot, that I just find, I just associate with going on holiday, really. But everyone talks about cash runway. So knowing what your monthly burn is, knowing what the cycle and the seasonality is. You're right, investors want to know that you are going to manage the cash properly. And but you don't need to be an accountant to do it, but you need to know the dynamics and the drivers, as you indicated.
Yes. I think quite often it's helpful if you're not an accountant when you're putting it together.
True.
I think the thing I was going to say was around once you start looking past that short-term 3 to 6 month cash flow, and if you're showing a spike in revenue, it's almost then understanding how you're going to achieve that. Is it, like you said, Ian, is it the conversion rate's going to go up? But then how are you justifying that in the short term? And is that your hiring, and then does that match up to what your cash flow then allows you to do? But I think there's quite a lot around just building it and then managing it going forward. So obviously we're kind of getting towards the back end of this sort of podcast and time-wise. What would your guys' sort of key piece of advice be to someone who's either looking at building their first cash flow, or they've built it and they're kind of getting into the real swing of managing it sort of month by month or week by week?
I think, as we've kind of alluded to really throughout the conversation, it's the importance of cash flow, and it's that saying that's used quite often in business: cash is king. It's extremely important to know where your business is going to be receiving money and spending money, and what the surpluses and shortfalls are, to allow you to make better plans and decisions, and to give you an insight into where you're at and where you want to go.
Ian?
I think make sure you know where stuff's coming in from and where it's going to. Stay on top of it. And, I'm just a great advocate about a team around a startup founder. So get the right support, get the right input from help, people who've got experience of doing this previously.
Yeah, I think I'd probably echo that, and without just copying the line from Thor Ragnarok, it's get help. Get people who know what they're doing, know the pitfalls, probably can look at the cash flow, who've not actually written it and go, well, how are you justifying this? How does this turn into this? Have you accounted for this rise by hiring someone, but then have you accounted for a potential recruitment fee? Because it's all these small pitfalls that I think people can fall into and miss, which then can also have a catastrophic effect further down the line.
Yeah. Well, let's not scare people. It isn't rocket science, but you need someone with good experience to do it. And it's one of those things that I think a founder needs someone to bounce, their assumptions off and what their judgment is on the forecast, and kind of just, being a bit frugal and having a rainy day and kind of saying, the sales forecast is 100, but actually we'll put 80 into the cash flow. It's not a bad thing either, having some judgment around it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And just on the finishing point, really, I'd say it's a really, really simple document to put in place, but the value you'll get out of it is much more than you'll have to put in to build it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, chaps, for today. Elliot, it was nice to have you back on.
Thanks, James. Yeah. Thanks, Ian.
So just in case people missed it on the last one, if anyone's got some questions or wants some help putting a cash flow together, Elliot, how can they get hold of you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Elliot Smith, not just an accountant, or you can email me at elliot@streamlineaccountancy.co.uk.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ian.
Brilliant. Thanks. Nice to see you. Thanks, guys.
Cheers, folks.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
I think that just about wraps things up here. If you have any thoughts or questions on anything we've said today, get in touch, whether that be through our Twitter @RealTSF or email at hello@startupfactory.tech, or feel free to drop in for a coffee and a chat. As ever, thanks for listening.